The leader is a leader because he is a servant. This leader is someone who inspires his followers, her followers.
Through our series of TutuTalks, the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation hopes to reframe unresolved issues within civil society and uncover what moral and ethical leadership entails.
Robtel, hi, thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk to you.
It's my pleasure, Pumi. Thank you for the invitation.
Awesome. So you describe yourself as a Liberian, as an academic, activist, and an author, which is quite a lot to encompass just one person. We will cover all of that in turn, but I just wanted to find out, first of all, where you're from, how did you grow up?
So I was born in Monrovia, which is on the coast of Liberia, and I left Liberia when I was 6 years old. I have very vivid memories of really interesting tidbits of growing up in Liberia. So I remember I went to a school called Calvary Baptist, and it was a primary school in which we wore these gold tinted uniforms. The shirts were gold tinted, and then the skirts were this hunter green, this deep hunter green. So I remember small things like that. I remember having a plum tree in my backyard. I remember playing with my half German cousins. So I spent the first 6 years of my life in Monrovia, and then I relocated to Washington, D.C., where my parents were living and working at the time. Grew up in D.C., went to primary school in DC, secondary school, as well as Howard University for my undergrad years, studied African history and politics, as well as English literature. And then I got the travel bug. So I have traveled, lived, and worked in about 7 different countries. In addition to completing undergrad in the US, I also did postgrad in the UK, but I also studied abroad at the University of Cape Town and the University of Ghana, as well as the American University in Cairo. So that's sort of my kind of professional as well as personal trajectory.
It does sound like you've seen more of the continent than those of us who actually live here.
That is my goal. So my goal is to visit all 54 to 55 countries, depending on who you ask in terms of those numbers, before I leave this earth. I've traveled to about half of the countries in the continent of Africa so far, and I'm still going.
Wow. And how have you maintained your connection to Liberia specifically?
Yeah, so my connection to Liberia, I always consider it to be a metaphysical connection to Liberia. So I left when I was very young, but I also maintained this very strong sense of purpose, strong sense of wanting to go back, sense of wanting to serve, wanting to give back to a country that gave me so much, even though I was displaced for a number of years in the US and in other parts of the globe. So I remain connected to Liberia because I'm politically engaged in the country. I also do primary research on Liberia. So my undergraduate honors thesis focused on the Liberian armed conflict. My postgraduate dissertation focused on Liberia and the process of Liberians who left during the 14-year armed conflict between 1989 and 2003 and went back as returnees. And then I eventually became a returnee myself after completing master's in African history and politics. And then my PhD work focused on citizenship and the contestations around dual citizenship in Liberia, which eventually was published into a book published by Cambridge University Press in January 2021. So my scholarly work is very, very much centered on Liberia, as well as my activism work. I've written 2 anti-corruption children's books, both of which are set in Liberia, although I consider them to be Pan-African children's books. And I have engaged with the Ministry of Education. I've engaged with Liberian activists, artists, in terms of collaborative work on turning these 2 narrative texts into multimedia tools. So yeah, my engagement with Liberia is very much entrenched, even though I live in the UK. In fact, I would consider myself a transnational. So I spend quite a bit of time in Liberia during the course of the academic year. I'm there during the summers. Last year, I made 3 trips to Liberia for various reasons. So it's home in many respects.
Wow. And you also worked for the government in Liberia at some point. Can you talk a bit more about that experience and what you learned from it?
Sure. So immediately after completing my master's degree, I was trying to find some way to get engaged with the country. So this is 2007. We're in the midst of a post-war moment. Liberia has just ended 14-year armed conflict in 2003. There was a peace agreement. We had an election in 2005, parliamentary or legislative, as well as presidential elections. And we happened to elect the first woman head of state in the entire continent of Africa, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And so I knew that I wanted to be a part of this very dynamic process. I knew that I wanted to get engaged politically, whether through working with the government or working in sort of humanitarian or development sector. And I kept getting these emails from people saying, "Oh, Robtel, there's this mid-career fellowship that's just being advertised. We think you would be perfect for it." And initially, I was a bit wary because I've never worked in the public sector before. I've heard some not so great things about public sector across the globe, not just in the continent of Africa. So I was a bit concerned because I come from an activist scholar background, but I thought, here's an opportunity that's presented itself. Let me take advantage of it, get my feet wet. And then if I decide that government work isn't for me, I'll move on to something else. So I applied for the fellowship and I landed the fellowship. And guess what, Pumi? They assigned me to the office of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first woman elected head of state in Africa and in Liberia. So I often describe those 4 years. I worked there from 2007 until 2011. I often describe those 4 years as bittersweet because I think one of the things that was quite apparent to me is the promise and the pitfalls of politics, right? That there's so much that can happen in terms of transformational change within the political realm, but there's also so much that can go wrong depending on whose agendas are being set, whose agendas are being met, whose agendas are being driven and taken on. So I would say, yeah, it was a bittersweet experience. I grew by leaps and bounds in terms of my own professional development, but also my personal development in terms of what I learned about Liberia. Like the experiential learning of Liberia is very different from the theoretical or what I read in books or researched or studied. I also had an opportunity to connect with my family, so extended family who had stayed during the war and never left, those perhaps who had come back. So it was a very affirming experience, but it did teach me a lot about, again, the promise and the pitfalls of politics, what politics can do that's transformational and good, but also how politics can be incredibly regressive.
When we were talking before, you gave the example of the scholarship program and getting an opportunity to work on that. Can you mention that example as well?
So one of the things that I had an opportunity to do is, I mean, because the politics in Liberia, as is the case in the continent of Africa, as is the case across the globe, is very much about specific agendas being set. And I think for all her faults, and I won't go into all of them, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is an incredibly complex politician, an incredibly complex woman. But one of the things that she did do was that she carved out a space for young professionals to really thrive and to show their mettle. So, as an example of one of the things that I was able to achieve, because obviously, in terms of transformational change, in many respects, it's incremental. So, I discovered that our bilateral scholarships program, so effectively scholarships from other countries that are then donated to Liberia, were our scholarships program was really mired in forms of graft and corruption. Scholarships were being given to the highest donors. Scholarships were being given to the relatives of government officials. And as someone who's benefited from scholarships pretty much my whole life, from secondary school throughout to my PhD, I thought that this was a real travesty, given that the root word of the word scholarship is scholar. So for me, the best and brightest in Liberia should have been given these opportunities. So there was a series of expose journal or articles that were published in one of the local dailies in Liberia. I think it was In Profile Daily, and it pretty much exposed the debacle around bilateral scholarships. And so I thought to myself, let me collect these articles, put together some sort of portfolio and give it to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf as a case for why we need to completely overhaul the system and reform it. So I did that. For about 2 or 3 weeks, I collected these expose stories and I clipped them out of the newspapers, took them to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the president of Liberia. Really, really, really scared about the kind of response I would get. And I made a case for why it was important to transform the system such that people could have confidence in the bilateral scholarships program. And then I made a case on my own sort of personal case that as someone who's benefited and had benefited from scholarships my entire life, that it was important to select the best and brightest for these programs. And so she said very well, even though some of her inner circle were implicated in this expose, she said very well, go ahead and do your investigation, substantiate any of the claims that are made by this particular newspaper, and come back to me with a set of recommendations. And so that's what I did. I did the investigation and I found out, sure enough, that the scholarships process was incredibly compromised. And one of the recommendations that I made to her is, how about we set up an interministerial scholarships committee comprising a number of different ministerial positions. And we put together this committee and we come up with some sort of reform of the scholarships program, everything from vetting to selection to making sure that it's transparent, the process is transparent, and that it's gender balanced. Because I also discovered that most of the scholarships were being given to young Liberian men, not necessarily young Liberian women. And there's no shortage of sharp, bright Liberian women scholars in the country. So she agreed with my approach. We set up the committee and we did, in the process of about 6 months, we did completely overhaul the process, set up a system that was very transparent, that was gender balanced, and that was fair. As a result of that, we were able to send off for the first year or two some of the most dynamic Liberians in all sectors. So doctors and engineers and geologists. And what we did with this particular scholarships process and the policy on bilateral scholarships, because we did come up with a policy, is that we realized that we needed to peg it to our capacity building efforts. Right? Liberia was in a really important state in terms of what capacity building needs we had. And so our approach was to focus on what are the capacities that are lacking in the country and how do we fill those gaps. So we were interested in healthcare professionals. We were interested in people who were doing mining engineering and geologists and public health workers, so forth and so on, educationists and so forth and so on. And we were able to send over 100 Liberians to different countries of the globe, many of whom have come back and also worked in the public sector. So we created a bond system such that they would have to serve for a certain number of years post-graduation.
That's an amazing opportunity for somebody to get, and kudos for being brave enough to raise the issue with her. How else are you using your academic work to make a difference in terms of how government operates?
Sure. So I mentioned earlier that I published or I wrote a PhD thesis that looks at dual citizenship and the contestations around dual citizenship in Liberia, but also focused on the entire continent of Africa, because as of now, over 3/4 of countries in the continent of Africa have some sort of established dual citizenship legislation. And there are only about 6 or 7 countries that are outliers that don't have dual citizenship legislation. Liberia happened to be one of them, although that might change very, very soon. So I really wanted to understand, why was it that Liberia was one of these outliers? And I discovered in 2008 that there was a dual citizenship bill that was introduced in Liberia, but never passed. It lingered in legislative limbo for about 10 years. So that was the entry point for the PhD thesis, to ask broader questions about what does it mean to be a citizen in a post-war context like Liberia, but also what does it mean to be a citizen in non-post-war countries that have not experienced crisis or rupture. So I wrote this PhD thesis, and it was eventually revised into a book, a monograph, which was published in January 2021. And the title of the monograph is "Development, Dual Citizenship, and Its Discontents in Africa: The Political Economy of Belonging to Liberia." And the intention of the book was twofold. It was first to influence the public discourse around dual citizenship, and the contestations around dual citizenship in Liberia. Because what I found, especially in the public discourse on places like Twitter and Facebook and on these social media platforms, is the conversation was very much based on people's sentiments, not based on any sort of evidence, right? The other intention was to influence the policymaking process around dual citizenship, because I think eventually dual citizenship could be a socioeconomic development enabler for the country. So I wanted to infuse the policy making discourse and the public discourse with evidence, such that that would drive the conversation and that would drive the policy making, not necessarily people's sentiments. And Pumi, I mean, the greatest gift anyone can give a researcher who does policy relevant research is to be able to engage with policymakers on a particular issue. And I'm just really pleased and just humbled that the Liberian Senate, as well as the Liberian House of Representatives, invited me to present my book, not only the findings of the book, but also the policy recommendations. And I believe that the presentation that I made, as well as a 2-page briefing to the Senate specifically, has had an impact on the policymaking process as it relates to dual citizenship in Liberia. So I think you'll be hearing something very soon in terms of Liberia foregoing its outlier status. The House of Representatives did pass a dual citizenship bill in November 2021, and the Senate, I believe, has passed a slightly revised version of the House's dual citizenship in May 2022, and they're right now in committee room trying to decide which version of the bill will eventually go forward. And I did present my findings as well as my recommendations. What I've discovered is that in the reconciled amended version that the Senate has passed, some of my recommendations to the Senate are reflected in that. So for me, again, it's incredibly humbling to be able to say that the twofold kind of intention I had with the book, influencing the public discourse and then influencing the policymaking process, have been fulfilled.
That's awesome. And the other thing you mentioned earlier was that you've written some children's books. Is that another way that you're making an impact?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that. I always wear my scholarly hat, but I have to remember that my authorial hat also is really important in terms of the work that I do with my children's books. So I wrote 2 anti-corruption children's books in 2012 and 2019, and the reason I wrote those books is because of my own kind of personal experience in the public sector, and not only the public sector, and realizing that corruption and graft happen in the private sector, but they also happen in everyday human interactions in Liberia, across the continent, across the globe. Of course, corruption is not an issue that's unique or germane to the continent of Africa. It happens everywhere. And we've seen cases of that in the news reportage. So as a result, I sort of got really frustrated and fed up with adults. And I thought to myself, it's important for us to have a conversation with children about what it means to have integrity and what it means to be not only accountable to oneself, but also one's community, one's nation, one's globe, one's continent. And so these 2 Pan-African children's books, the first one is titled Bagba, and in Bassa, which is my mother's language, there are 16 languages spoken in Liberia, and Bassa happens to be one of them. So in Bassa, the word Bagba means that bad thing. That's what it's loosely translated as. And for me, it's also loosely translated as corruption, right? So in the first book, Bagba, it follows a few days in the lives of twin characters, Sandema and Sandega, who leave the port city of Buchanan, where my mother grew up and my father grew up. And they come to Monrovia and they have a series of experiences that remind them of this word Bagba, corruption, that bad thing, which is effectively, the way I describe it in the book, is lying, cheating, and stealing, just to simplify it for children. So the first book is about what not to do, right? How corruption pervades societies. And then the second book, which is a sequel to Bagba, is called Jade. And Jade in Bassa means integrity, truthfulness, honesty. And so the twin characters, Sandema and Sandega, in the sequel have a series of experiences and encounters that remind them of this word Jade, integrity, honesty, truthfulness. Because I think it's important to show children modeled behavior. So if we want children to have integrity, if we want children to be truthful and honest, we adults have a responsibility to emulate that in our everyday human interactions. Because I think children have this sort of uncanny ability to mirror what they see. But in addition to that, the books are really intentionally to describe to adults that children are honest until we socialize them to be dishonest, right? So these Pan African books have been incorporated in the Liberian curriculum. They are used as supplemental readers for third to fifth graders in Liberia as well as in Ghana. At the moment, the books are under review in about 5 or 6 different African countries, including South Africa, in terms of the possibility of using them in core texts in primary school, whether it's religious education or civic education. The books have also been adapted into multimedia tools. So I partnered with a Liberian hip hop artist by the name of Takunje, who's very popular, but he's also an activist in his own right, and he has adapted the books into songs and a music video. We also have radio dramas that have been adapted, a multimedia website. We also have, and what I'm most excited about is a stage play based on the 2 books that I partnered with a local theater group called Flomo Theater, and they have adapted the books into a stage play which debuted in Monrovia, Liberia, with an all-child cast. So we've done a lot with the books, and I've also toured the books. So I've done workshops across the continent of Africa, but also in places in the Middle East, in Asia, in Latin America. So the books are Pan-African, but they're also global in terms of the kinds of messages that I'm trying to portray. That children are important anti-corruption allies. They're important integrity advocates, and I'm using them as my allies in this sort of, I call it a revolution from below, because for me, processes of transparency and accountability can be taught by children because, again, they have this uncanny ability to remind us about why it's important and how we can emulate the kind of citizenship, active citizenship through our own integrity efforts.
So you started off by saying you wrote the books because you were tired of the grown-ups or tired of the adults. Is this something that's a side hustle for you, or is this a direction that you're going to go? What are you hoping will happen with the books, and maybe just children's books in general?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because I do call it a side hustle, but I think of it more as a labor of love, right? And it's something that's so very much part and parcel of my activism work, right? It's so much that's so part and parcel of my storytelling work, because I think of myself as a scholar. Yeah, that's one hat that I wear, but I also think of myself as a storyteller. So watch this space, Pumi. There might be other children's books with other subject matters that are important in terms of socially redeeming values and qualities that I think we should all be having really important conversations with children about. But yeah, it's absolutely a labor of love, and the workshops fill me with such hope, because what's uncanny to me is that children understand corruption. They've internalized it, and they can tell you exactly what it looks like in terms of their own particular context and how it manifests itself. But nobody's asking them how it impacts them and how it confuses them when we tell them one thing but we do another. So labor of love, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with the fact that children know until we socialize them otherwise to do the wrong thing. And we, I think here at the foundation, feel very strongly that we can help children to understand right from wrong, and the values that you should have as a human being. And we have a very good example of that in terms of Archbishop Tutu. What have you learned about him that you admire and that you try to live in your own life?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many values. I one of the things that I do remember about the Arch, because I did have a chance to meet with him when I was a Tutu Fellow eons ago in 2010. It seems like so long ago. Was his infectious laughter. I mean, the ability to just express joy in the midst of so much sorrow. Because if you succumb to that, then you lose all hope, right? And as far as I'm concerned, as long as we're living, we have to have hope. So that hopeful optimism that he had for me is really, really important. And I think that was reflected in his infectious laugh. I mean, it was such a distinct laugh that anybody who hears it knows that's the Arch's laugh, right? I think the other value that I subscribe to, and I think is important in terms of how we serve, how we lead, how we lead by example, is this idea of servant leadership, right? And and it traces back to my point about how when I work for the government of Liberia, in terms of engagement with not just government officials, but also so-called donors and people who work in the humanitarian sector and the UN and the private sector, is the absence of that understanding of you are in a position to serve. You are in a position to perhaps transform the lives of others through the work that you do. And that servant leadership, that sense of humility, that sense of I am here to learn as much as I'm here to teach. I am here to give as much as I am here to take. I think another value that the Arch stood for, that has been so much ingrained in just my upbringing from my parents, is this notion of speaking truth to power. No matter how much or how little power you believe that you have, rejecting the abuses of power, especially when you are in a space where you have the power to speak to those who make important decisions in the lives of other people. I think he also encouraged or pushed the idea of preserving human dignity. So, how are we preserving human dignity in the policies that we enact? How are we preserving human dignity in the kinds of economic activities that we engage in? How are we preserving human dignity in the way that we live our lives on a day-to-day basis? How are we preserving human dignity in our interactions with other human beings on this earth? How are we preserving human dignity in terms of the way that we treat the earth, right? In terms of our own carbon footprint. So for me is so important in terms of thinking about how I inhabit this earth, how I interact with other people, and the things that I do that will eventually make a difference in the lives of others. So for me, that's it in a nutshell. There's a lot there. Like there's a lot I could say more about the Arch's values, but maybe I'll stop there.
So you've managed to make an impact at a relatively young age using your talents. What do other young people do to make an impact in your view?
So I'm going to put my activist hat on, Pumi, now, and just say there's this quote. I always forget the full quote, but there's a quote by Martin Luther King Jr., the very famous and in some cases infamous civil rights leader in the United States. And he talks about this idea of being maladjusted to injustice, right? And I love that idea of being maladjusted to injustice. So that's sort of my mantra in terms of when I'm thinking about my activist work. I would say it was popularized by Cornel West, who's the African American public intellectual, activist, so forth and so on. So I would say the advice that I would give to young people, or young at heart, is to really figure out how can you be maladjusted to injustice as it manifests itself in all forms, right? In your professional work, in your personal day-to-day interactions, and again, the way you carry yourself and the way you inhabit the space that you've been given. The other advice I would give in terms of making an impact is preparation. So I have this pet peeve, and the pet peeve is when people say, "Oh, young people in the continent of Africa, or young people in Latin America, or young people in North America, or young people in other parts of other parts of the globe, Asia, should be given a seat at the table." And I really, really have a problem with that dictum, because I don't think anybody should be entitled to a seat at the table. I think one of the things that young people can do is to prepare yourself, arm yourself with the tools to make an impact, and to bring the chair to the table, as Shirley Chisholm argued, African American woman who was the first woman to run for presidency in the United States. She served as senator previously, right? So, what are the tools? Going to school, whether it's vocational schooling or university, whatever's required for that kind of impact that you envisage for yourself. Learn the tricks of the trade. Again, arm yourself with the tools, do the hard work. Everybody wants to be a social media star, but nobody wants to put in the hard work. And then I think most importantly, also surrounding yourself with people who have the same kinds of values, who are committed to transformational change, who believe that human dignity should be preserved for everybody and everything on this earth. And do check-ins, surround yourself with people who've achieved the kind of greatness or the kind of impact that you think is important. Reach out to them, no matter how high up they happen to be in the totem pole. And then your circle of friends, your circle of professional colleagues, your circle of people who will hold you accountable is also really important, because I think sometimes when we get to the point where we are on this trajectory of achievement, we lose sight of what our ultimate values are. And so if you have a group of people who will hold you accountable, who will remind you of that value of integrity, then I think you're on a really, really important transformational path. But do the work. It's not going to be handed to you on a silver platter. I mean, I saw that when I was working for the government of Liberia. I was in my mid-20s when I moved to Liberia and started working with Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And nobody was handing me anything on a silver platter. I had to make myself relevant. I had to speak truth to power in a way that was meaningful and that didn't feel threatening to certain people, but that was also truth. So yeah, do the work, do the hard work.
Yeah. So my last question to you is, you've had exposure to a great president. You've worked with her. What is your ambition in terms of where you want to go? Because it sounds like politics is a thing for you. Where do you want to take it?
You're gonna get me into trouble, Pumi. I will have to say that Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was a complex president. She was a complex political animal. I don't know if I would use the word great. I think that story is still being written, and it's being written by a number of people, myself included, in terms of the analysis. But I will say that one of the things that she did do was open up the scope for people who'd never thought about politics as a career path, myself included. Actually, no, I won't say that. At one point in my life, when I was growing up in DC, I told myself that I wanted to be the first woman head of state in Africa and in Liberia. And then, ironically enough, years later, I end up working for her. And I realized that aspirational goal, although noble, when you get into the nitty gritty of it, it's actually quite hard. Being a head of state of a government is really, really difficult, because you're constantly competing with everybody's agendas, and you have to stay true again to who you are and your vision and your values. But watch this space. I am very, very interested in politics, and I'm probably just going to leave it there and say that my scholarly hat, my scholarly professional trajectory is not just going to be the endpoint for me, because ultimately politics has an impact on everything. In terms of inequalities, it has an impact on what we can and cannot achieve. And so if we don't get involved in politics, and not everybody has to run for office, but if we don't get involved in politics, then business as usual will continue to prevail. And I see business as usual prevailing in Liberia. I see business as usual prevailing in the continent of Africa. I see business as usual prevailing in Europe, where I sit in London. And I think there has to be a different progressive form of politics. So you know who I'm inspired by, Pumi? I'm inspired by Francia Marquez, the first Black woman vice president who has just been elected in Colombia. And when that election took place and she and Petro won, the first leftist president and vice president in the history of Colombia, it made me realize, you know what, there is hope for progressive politics. A progressive politics that is steeped in this, again, idea of preserving human dignity. I am inspired. So yeah, who knows? Who knows what will happen? And beyond that, I think, her background is somebody who comes from a very marginalized position. Her background as a woman who really fought, to get to the place that she is. She went to law school. She did the hard work, right? She was an environmental justice activist in her community, a feminist activist in her community for a number of years. And then she entered politics because she said, politics mess with me, and now I'm going to mess with it. So politics mess with all of us, and we'll see if we're strong enough and brave enough to be someone like a Francia Marquez, and involve ourselves in politics, whether it's in small or big ways. But yeah, I am going to involve myself in politics in both small and big ways in Liberia. So just watch this space. That's all I'm going to say.
Definitely will watch this space, and I wish you all the best with it. I think you have the right amount of passion for making a change. Thank you very much, Robtel, for talking to us today.
Thank you, Pumi. I appreciate the invitation again.